Welcome back. If you are just joining us, this is INX Prime Live. Remember, we are on your screens every single Monday to Friday between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. Now, Nigerian investigative journalist and author David Hundeyin has revealed a startling attempt by an international environmental NGO to bribe him to write a hit piece, obviously discouraging as well as attacking the newly commissioned petroleum refinery. Now, the refinery is Africa's richest man, who is Aliko Dangote. Now, the refinery is currently the largest in the world, and when fully operational will process about 650,000 barrels of crude oil per day. The massive refinery will also save Nigeria billions every single year, as the country currently imports petroleum products. What is behind the apparent smear campaign against this massive infrastructure investment? Well, we are going to be chatting to David Hundeyin, who actually joins me right now to be able to chat a little bit more about it. Good evening, David, and thank you for joining us here at INX Prime Live.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure having you. I want to get straight into this conversation. And again, thank you for your time, David. Now, South Africans can relate to what Nigeria is going through. I mean, if the just energy transition movement were to actually have its way, we wouldn't be enjoying the abundant coal-fired electricity, as the plan was to decommission some of our coal fleets in the name of the environment. Now, please, can you share with us how you were approached and to what end?
Okay, so it's not a rarity for journalists to be approached by a commissioning editor, be it from a media platform or from an NGO or whatever, to write an article on a specific topic. Why this one sort of caught my attention specifically was the manner of approach. It was clear that it was implied that something was being hidden. And well, if we can only proceed with this conversation if you indicate that you're open to writing something about Dangote Refinery. And I saw that this person is from a climate focused NGO. So I smelled a rat. So I said, sure, I'm open to it, send a brief. And they sent the brief. I read through the brief. And it was immediately clear what this was, that this wasn't just a brief to write an article, right? This was it was an instruction manual to write a very specific and very detailed instruction manual to write something that could be used to discredit the very basis for existence of this refinery, using the language of environmental concerns and energy transition commitments made by the Nigerian government and so on. Right. And the idea was clearly that someone somewhere already has a fully fleshed out idea of how they want to approach this for the purpose of narratively discrediting this refinery using environmental concerns, but it's important to use a local face and a local voice to be the face of this thing. And apparently that's the hole that I was supposed to fit into. I'm guessing because I've been a vocal critic of Aliko Dangote in the past, so maybe I was perceived as someone who would be sort of useful in this regard.
Yeah.
But clearly that was a miscalculation, because I immediately saw it for what it was, that this is a British NGO. It's an NGO called Dialogue Earth. They're based in London. They're headed by an academic, a professor at the University of Oxford. They used to be known as the China Dialogue Trust. They used to be focused almost exclusively on China. Now they're focused on much of the global south. So they're active in South America, they're active in Asia, and increasingly active in Africa now. In fact, the email originated from the Africa office of this NGO, which happens to be based in Nairobi, as so many of these NGOs are. And like when I did some digging into who funds this NGO, it was like a who's who of the sort of American establishment, CSO and CSO funding entity. So to my eyes, it was very clear that this is, pardon my French, right? But this is a bunch of white people in DC who are sitting down and sort of taking decisions from a great height and saying, no, you people in Africa shouldn't have this. And I don't see why we shouldn't have it. But as you rightly said, Nigeria spends billions, not just spending billions, but it's Nigeria's largest single foreign expense every year, importing refined petroleum products. Meanwhile, Nigeria is Africa's largest crude oil exporter. It makes no sense. Why should Nigeria be struggling to import derivatives of the very thing that is its biggest export? It does not make any sense. And this has been this case that has persisted for decades. And now you have a refinery, a piece of infrastructure that is going to reverse that dynamic. And someone in DC or someone in London is not happy about it. And then they want to use a local face to be the spearhead of the campaign to narratively attack this thing. That doesn't sit right with me at all.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And I mean, also just looking at some of the visuals of the refinery, I think it looks absolutely incredible. And it's nice to see, something that we can be proud of in terms of Africa. But away from that, let's just talk about, also the concept that perhaps, the fact that they also gave some money and put some money on the table just for you to be able to write this article. I mean, that goes against a lot of journalist ethics as well. But it's also coming from a place where you can see the intention and the narrative. But just going back to the smear campaign, we know that it did become public and this attempt was actually put out there. What has been the response by Nigerians and your colleagues in the industry? I mean, at the end of the day, we keep on mentioning this thing about, honor and ethics in the journalist space.
So the response has been generally positive, overwhelmingly positive, actually. But as is always the case, there are always a few people who can always constantly be relied on to be the sort of spoilers or the saboteurs, if you use that kind of language. And sure enough, within 24 hours of me going public with this thing, a counter narrative had been mobilized. I'm not going to mention the name of the media platform in Nigeria, but it's a media platform which is funded by NGO money. So I'm guessing it's no surprise that the sort of call to arms was made on behalf of one of their NGO brethren, and the narrative was that, oh, I played it out of proportion. I was being sensationalist. It's really not that big a deal. I'm a non-expert in the field of energy transition, and if Dialogue Earth did anything wrong, it was that they tried to delegate this task to a non-expert. So essentially the idea behind this narrative is that actually nothing wrong happened whatsoever. There's nothing untoward about a group of people in London and in DC making decisions regarding Africa's energy sovereignty without the input of Africans, and then trying to use Africans as the face of it, and then paying Africans to be the face of what they might not even agree with, knowing fully well that most journalists in Africa would, they would take the offer because, it's probably the easiest $500 you'll ever make. It's 3 hours of work.
Yeah.
You just write something down and you get paid, right? So, but apparently they did nothing wrong, and there's nothing to see here. So it's just, David Hundeyin being sensationalistic, apparently. So that's the counter narrative that some people have tried to mobilize. But overwhelmingly, the response has been not just positive, but also one of sort of relief that, okay, for once, it is the case that when these sort of external or foreign actors are trying to meddle or interfere in Africa, as they so often do, that for once, it is the case that there is actual pushback from people who are positioned to push back. So for once, it's not as if Africa is just a passive victim. That for once, Africa is choosing to be a protagonist and stand up for itself.
And I think it's so important that people like you actually come out and hold that sense of honor as well. I just want to touch on something as well. I mean, you did mention that they were going to offer to pay you $500, which is very little in terms of pushing this agenda. That they're also trying to push out. But like you said, a lot of your African journalists would take that offer. I just want to go and follow the money though. So, when you usually follow the money to find out which interests are being served by these environmental groups, which countries or companies do you feel benefit the most if there is negative press on a Dangote, for example?
So, first and foremost, from a geopolitical standpoint, the political and economic interests that have historically liked the status quo, obviously will be the first beneficiaries, because it has been the case for pretty much all of Africa's post-colonial history and all of Nigeria's post-colonial histories that these countries export raw materials cheaply, such as Nigeria exporting crude oil, and then they import finished products at a premium, such as Nigeria importing petrol and diesel and whatnot. So by design, African currencies never appreciate and are never stable. African currencies are on a constant downward trend by design. So by design, African wealth is constantly being eroded. You can't use an African currency as a store of value. Maybe a South African rand is a bit of an exception because the South African economy is structured a bit differently. But the vast majority of Africa, you cannot use local currencies as a store of value because of that basic economic issue. And that economic problem for Africa is an economic boon for Europe and for North America. So obviously, those geopolitical interests would very much like to preserve that status quo, and they will not be happy about infrastructure like Dangote Refinery potentially reversing that. But drilling down to who specifically might be affected in the oil refining space in Europe, if you look at the rankings in terms of sizes of the refineries in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region, the Dangote Refinery is almost twice as large as the next largest one, which I believe is in Rotterdam, which is owned by Shell. So I think that one is about 400,000 barrels a day. Dangote Refinery is about 650,000 barrels a day. And in addition to being much bigger and having, the economies of scale that come with that kind of size, it's also much newer. The technologies are much more up to date. So it's much more efficient than those ones, which gives it a competitive advantage. If you're familiar with how the business of refining works, every $2 in margin is a very big deal because it's a low margin, high volume business.
Yeah.
So it's been projected so I spoke to someone at Vitol, which is a very well-known oil trading company. I spoke to an engineer there who told me point blank that by the time that Dangote Refinery comes fully on stream and starts doing its daily capacity of 650,000 barrels a day, there are at least 2 refiners on the coast of Europe that are going to shut down. Many other refineries are going to be affected, but there are going to be at least 2 that are going to shut down outright because Dangote Refinery is basically going to take business away from them. So from that point of view, you can it's very easy to see who will definitely not be happy about it. So it's not just the fact that a new competitor, a huge competitor is coming into the space and is eating their lunch. It's also the case that this is an African competitor and it potentially reverses, 5 or 6 centuries worth of, the economic dynamic between Europe and Africa. Some people are obviously not best pleased about that. It has also been the case, for example, that for many years, because of West Africa's import dependence on Europe for refined fuel, the fuels heading to Africa have been used as a sort of dumping ground for everything that the European refiners want to get rid of and can't get rid of. If you recall, in 2006, there was a very famous incident in Cote d'Ivoire where the oil trader Trafigura blended several cargoes of petrol heading to Abidjan with toxic waste. To date, nobody knows what the exact death toll of that action was. Right? And it's not just that incident. There have been several incidents where they blend sort of high sulfur content with the cargoes heading to Africa. So like when you're done with the refining process and the sort of sludge that nobody really wants, you can't do anything with, and it's very difficult and environmentally hazardous to dispose of, you blend that into the cargoes going to West Africa, and that becomes their problem, and nobody's going to do anything about it because, after all, it's just Africa. That has been the case for decades. And then Dangote Refinery coming onto the scene potentially disrupts that entire ecosystem of I don't know what term to use, but it disrupts that entire dynamic that has existed. So clearly, some people are not going to be happy about it.
No, without a doubt, David. And, I think it's so much of great information that you shared with us to get a better understanding of it. And we hope that, Africa can actually protect its interests, especially when there's all these outside external factors trying to influence and, push their own agendas. And they definitely have the budgets and the resources to be able to do that. But we need to protect our assets in Africa without a doubt. But again, David, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And it was definitely a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome, guys. That is David Hundeyin, who is actually a Nigerian investigative journalist as well as an author, just sharing with us, important information when it comes to NGOs and how they try their best to be able to influence and also create their own agendas by paying off journalists in African countries to write bad stories about Africa, so that Africa is always on the back foot over countries in the UK as well, in the UK as well as countries in Europe as well. But on that note, we are going to take a quick ad break. We'll come right back.